it's time for me to talk about gun control in the United States. I know this conversation has been going on for some time, but I think I need to weigh in on it. In fact, I'm overdue in speaking out on this topic, as a lot of body bags have been filled since the time when I changed my opinion on this topic to now when I'm choosing to speak out. I should state from the beginning that I am not for the abolition of private firearm ownership in the United States, but I do believe that the current regulatory scheme surrounding the legalization of assault weapons is far too loose. So let me get specific. I think it's time that we reintroduce the federal ban on assault weapons. What I mean when I say assault rifle is the civilian version of high-powered semi-automatic rifles that have interchangeable high-capacity magazines. An AR-15 or the numerous clones would be considered an assault rifle, whereas a semi-automatic Remington Model 740 would not be. The key distinction of an assault rifle, such as an AR-15, is the speed at which a new high-capacity magazine can be reloaded. The most popular cartridge for these types of assault rifles is .223 caliber or the 5.56 millimeter, which is a small, extremely fast cartridge, which propels a bullet at a 50 to 70 grain bullet at speeds of 2,500 to 3,500 feet per second. These ballistic characteristics make this an ideal weapon of attack against human-sized targets at ranges of up to 300 yards. The high-powered, high-capacity nature of assault rifles make them ideal for military situations in which rapid, follow-up shots may be required to suppress enemy soldiers. But it also makes them unnecessary for hunting situations, as game animals do not carry weapons and do not fire back. And they're also less than ideal for self-defense situations, which typically occur at very short ranges and which a high-powered assault rifle creates a problem of target over-penetration. My thinking on gun control has developed over the years, and I feel I should probably share why and how I've changed my mind on this topic. Although I vote in every election, I'm not a member of any political party, so I'm not trying to advocate for one party platform over another. In fact, I think this should not even be an ideological issue. I think there's common ground that people of goodwill can come together on this issue and agree on some common sense reforms. In earlier eras of American history, gun control was a bipartisan issue, and laws such as the National Firearm Act of 1934 had broad support of both political parties. However, in the past 50 years or so, this issue has evolved into one of the key tenets of the Republican Party platform. Gun control is a nuanced issue. However, the current rhetoric surrounding it is anything but nuanced, particularly on the Second Amendment Absolutist side of the House. I'm going to tell my story of how I developed my thinking on gun control and how my thinking has changed over the years. I was born in the early 1980s, and I like to say that I was a child of the Cold War, both figuratively in that the Cold War thinking permeated my household, and literally in that my parents met each other while working for the Department of Defense in the 1970s. There are several types of Vietnam War veterans. There are ones who saw the Vietnam War as a huge mistake to begin with, and there are those who felt that the only mistake was not winning the war. My father was definitely in the latter camp, and I grew up with a lot of conservative talking points rattling around in my brain. My father had a long commute to work and would frequently listen to right-wing talk radio on the AM dial. When he got home, we'd frequently have long discussions about politics and policy, where I would get secondhand rhetoric from his favorite host, Michael Savage. And I think I was a freshman in high school when I found a copy of Barry Goldwater's book, Conscience of a Conservative, in the library of my private Christian high school. That book in particular stood out as it helped me form my early political thinking. I followed that up with other books by right-wing and populist authors until eventually I ended up with a subscription to the John Birch Society magazine, The New American. I was a sophomore in high school when the Columbine shooting occurred. and it had a profound emotional impact upon me, as I was the same age as most of the victims, as well as the perpetrators. I say it had a profound emotional impact because that's all it was. With all of the right-wing propaganda bouncing around in my head, I failed to take any political action to advocate for gun control measures that might have stopped the next school shooting. I blamed the senseless violence of the Columbine shooting on the mental health issues of the shooters, which, according to the right-wing news commentators, was aggravated by the goth subculture or violent video games or whatever culture war boogeyman the right-wing pundits were going on about at that time. Although there were definitely mental health issues involved with the perpetrators of that shooting, it was their access to high-powered semi-automatic firearms that turned what otherwise might have been just a sad story of juvenile delinquency into a mass slaughter in which so many innocent young lives were lost needlessly. At the time, I empathized deeply with the victims of that shooting, but argued with anybody who would listen that the answer was not gun control. I argued that bad guys would get their guns on the black market and that gun control would do nothing to prevent mass shootings such as Columbine. I made the argument that just like the prohibition on drugs did not prevent criminal gangs from smuggling in narcotics, that a ban on guns would only result in law-abiding citizens being prevented from owning firearms, while criminals would have unrestricted access to guns. In my late teens and early 20s, the following arguments were my go-to on the topic of gun control. I'm going to list these briefly, and then I'm going to go more in depth on each of these arguments and discuss how my thinking has evolved. I'm making this video in the year 2023, and it's interesting to look back on the last 25 years of our public life in the United States and how the evidence of history has weighed in on these arguments. First argument was, private ownership of guns are a necessary check on the power of government. Private ownership of firearms have been and continue to be a deterrent against foreign invaders. Mass shootings are the result of other societal factors, and loose gun control laws do not contribute to the problem. Even if you did enact gun control, criminals would still sneak guns in over the border, and law-abiding citizens would be the only ones at a disadvantage. If the majority of people carried guns on a regular basis, then crime would decrease, because criminals would be afraid of being shot by law-abiding citizens. Guns are a part of American culture. And lastly, there's a slippery slope between the ban on assault rifles and the ban on all guns. So let me start with my first go-to argument that guns were a necessary check on the power of government. A friend of mine from the John Birch Society used to talk about the 3 boxes of freedom: the soapbox, the ballot box, and if those failed, then the cartridge box. This is still a popular argument for the private ownership of what some would refer to as assault rifles. But let me tell you something. Anybody who tells you that an AR-15 or any of the other assault-type rifles is not specifically to be a man killer is either lying or he's ignorant. The only conceivable legitimate reason to own an assault rifle is in a military context. But teenage me would fully agree. And I would have told you that that's the whole point of why they should be legal. A younger me, as well as the vast majority of Second Amendment absolutists, would say that it is desirable that private individuals and militias have access to assault rifles so that the government does not have a monopoly on power. There used to be a bumper sticker that was popular in the 90s that said, "All in favor of gun control, raise your hand," and there's a picture of Adolf Hitler giving the Nazi salute. This bumper sticker and the thought behind it was that totalitarian governments cannot tolerate a well-armed population, and the private ownership of military-grade rifles was necessary to prevent the United States from turning into some sort of fascist or communist state. I used to make the argument that if the Jewish people were armed, that the Holocaust would not have occurred. But I made this argument out of historical ignorance, as I later found out that there were instances in which Jews were armed, such as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and various Jewish partisan groups. So while it's true that Germany during the 1930s and 40s may have had restrictive gun laws, the territories that they occupied and annexed did not, and there was widespread firearm distribution. In those days, due to abandoned military caches from conquered governments and the small arms that the Allied governments managed to smuggle in. Partisan activity undoubtedly contributed to the eventual downfall of the Axis government, but this was only in conjunction with the broader Allied effort. So to say that the proliferation of small firearms could have it by itself toppled the Axis powers in World War II is historically naive, and it discounts the important role of the professional militaries of the Allied governments. And I'd also like to add that if you actually look at it, the history, in 1938, the Nazis actually even loosened some of the restrictive gun control laws. So the idea that totalitarian governments are somehow afraid of private firearm ownership doesn't hold up, at least not in the case of Nazi Germany. And today, one of the most totalitarian governments is the Russian Federation, led by the dictator Vladimir Putin. And it's also interesting that they also have some of the most liberal gun laws in all of Asia. There are more political prisoners today in Putin's Russia than there were during the darkest days of the Soviet Empire. If loose gun control laws don't prevent tyrants from Putin from seizing and maintaining power, then they would be otherwise inadequate in our country. You see, as it turns out, even the vaunted AR-15 is ineffective against militarized police forces, such as the Russian Federal Guard Service, which operates heavy equipment such as armored personnel carriers. You see, if somebody with an AR-15 or an AK-47 were to go up against an armored personnel carrier, his life would be forfeit. Think about it. If small arms were truly a threat to Vladimir Putin, then he would ban them. He has the power to do so. If you want to know what truly frightens a totalitarian government, then you ought to look at what they actually do ban. Which leads me into my next argument that I used to make, that private ownership of firearms have been and continue to be a deterrent against foreign invaders. And that assault rifles are an important part of this deterrent. This argument cited the fact that the United States has not faced large-scale invasion since the War of 1812. But here again, the geography of the United States probably has more to do with why the United States has not had to face a major land invasion. The logistics of landing and supplying an army over a body of water the size of the Pacific or the Atlantic Oceans is immense, and very few countries in the world would have the resources to carry out such an undertaking. The last time the territory of the United States was directly attacked by a foreign military power was in World War II by the Imperial Japanese government. So I don't have to speculate about whether the Japanese government of World War II would have sent an invasion force to the United States, because they actually did on the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. And it seems that the Japanese were less deterred by the civilian ownership of firearms, like this picture of Grandpa with his shotgun, than they were disabled by the United States Navy at the Battle of Midway. Even hypothetically, if the United States were threatened by military invasion, the utility of an AR-15 would be limited. In order for the argument that the Second Amendment is designed as a deterrent against foreign invasion to hold any water, the Second Amendment would need to be loosened even more to include anti-tank and anti-air missile systems. Can you imagine what would happen if any of the mass shooters over the past 25 years were able to legally purchase an anti-tank missile system? The current war in Ukraine is a perfect example of how the private ownership of firearms is not a military deterrent. Ukraine, since 2014, has had various private militias operating in the eastern front of the country. And small arms ownership in Ukraine is widespread, including assault rifles. But as it turns out, even AK-47s are not effective as anti-tank weapons, and that systems such as the javelin missile are far more effective at repulsing an enemy that attacks with tanks and armored personnel carriers. But even if the Second Amendment was created to serve a military deterrent, it failed spectacularly when General Robert Ross of the British Army burned Washington, D.C. in 1814. Now, I'd like to point out that the technological gap between military and civilians in 1814 was much smaller than it is today. You see, a well-armed American civilian of 1814 had weapons that were not that much different than those carried by the British invasion force. Compare this to today, where even the best armed American civilian is no match against a modern military that uses drones, tanks, artillery, and attack helicopters, and all the rest of the weapons. I should point out that in 1814, there were many people who would have been alive when the Second Amendment was signed into law in 1791. So if you want to go down the original intent rabbit hole, think about that. While I do think that national defense is an important issue, I think that there are other, more effective ways to deter foreign invasion than allowing civilians to own military-grade weapons. For example, having a large, dispersed, reserve military force, such as the National Guard, which does have access to assault rifles, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, it seems like a far more sensible deterrent to foreign invasion. So moving on to the next argument that I used to make, that mass shootings are the result of other societal factors and that loose gun laws don't contribute to the problem. I agree that assault rifles don't necessarily cause mass shootings. However, they do make them more lethal and increase the number of victims. To say that guns cause crime is like saying that automobiles cause car crashes. But unlike an automobile that's designed for numerous practical purposes, an assault rifle is designed to kill humans with rapid follow-up shots in case the first one misses, and a large magazine capacity that enables the shooter to engage multiple targets. We shouldn't be surprised by mass shootings when the product that was specifically designed to conduct these types of operations is legally available. It is nauseating but unremarkable when the phrase that is most commonly uttered by journalists when reporting on mass shooting is, quote, "The killer obtained the firearms legally." There are those who say that background checks should be more thorough to screen out potential maniacs. And while I do not think that this is necessarily a bad idea, I think it's only a partial solution. The reason is that most mass shooters pass the FBI background check when they buy their guns, because their shooting spree will oftentimes be the first serious felony that they commit. Furthermore, in many cases, the shooter doesn't even have to purchase the guns himself, as the assault rifle might have been purchased by a family member, such as was the case with the shooter in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre. In that case, the mother bought the assault rifle for her son, who used it to murder 20 elementary school children, as well as 6 school personnel. I have no doubt that the perpetrator of Sandy Hook massacre was a deeply disturbed individual, and probably would have committed murder by other means if he did not have access to an assault rifle. But the carnage that an AR-15 style rifle was able to wreak pales into comparison to the other weapons that he might have used. The phenomenon of a crazed individual committing acts of violence against children in school settings is not a uniquely American phenomenon. However, what is uniquely American is the lethality of these attacks. There are stories of knife-wielding maniacs in China who attack children in schools, but the death toll in these situations is limited due to the fact that a knife is a far less effective weapon than an assault rifle. The perpetrator of the 2017 attack on the Las Vegas Music Festival would not have been able to murder 61 people if the only guns he was able to get his hands on were the lower capacity hunting rifles. We know from first-hand accounts of that night that shortly after the first shots rang out, people began to rapidly disperse from the target area. the fact that the shooter had long-range, rapid-fire assault rifles with high-capacity magazines ensured that he was able to inflict maximum carnage before the crowd could completely disperse. Which leads us into the next argument, that even if you did enact gun control laws, criminals would still sneak guns over the border and law-abiding citizens would be at a disadvantage. So I don't disagree with this argument, in that I think it's true that even if you did pass an assault weapons ban, professional criminals such as drug traffickers and mafia would still find a way to access assault rifles on the black market. And while I do appreciate the efforts of law enforcement to try to stamp out the black market, I acknowledge their limitations. The good thing is that most violence perpetuated by professional criminals of this nature is against other professional criminals. While it's true that innocent civilians sometimes get caught in the crossfire of gangland disputes, it is unlikely that civilian ownership of assault rifles would make a difference in these situations. Most civilians would never knowingly put themselves in the middle of a gangland dispute. So even if they owned an assault rifle, they likely would not be carrying it on their person at the time of the gunfight. Furthermore, a civilian caught in between a gangland dispute between gangsters is typically not the target. But as soon as a civilian pulled out their own assault rifle, then they would likely become the target of both sides of the dispute. I'm no self-defense expert, but I think that probably the best thing that a civilian can do when caught in the crossfire of rival criminal syndicates is to take cover and to leave the vicinity as rapidly as practically possible. I acknowledge that in a mass shooting situation, having a firearm might sometimes be helpful, as it may allow the civilians to neutralize the shooter. I use the word sometimes because if the shooter is in a sniper position, such as the Las Vegas Music Festival shooter, then it would be nearly impossible to return fire, even if you could locate the shooter. I would also like to add that if in a crowd shots rang out and suddenly 10 civilians pulled out their personal firearms, then they would likely mistake each other for the shooter, and when the police showed up, they might open up fire on the civilians, mistaking them for the original shooter. I have been fortunate in my life to have never experienced a gunfight, personally. But I have talked to those who have, and they have all related that gunfights are chaotic and frenzied. A civilian pulling out a gun in a mass shooting situation is putting himself at risk of friendly fire. That being said, I will admit that some mass shootings have been stopped by civilian firearm usage. But this has been when the civilian was carrying a concealed pistol rather than an assault rifle. As a reminder, I'm not advocating for the ban on all personal firearms, but I'm merely advocating for the ban on assault weapons, and including assault rifles. The only difference that a ban on an assault rifle might have on a mass shooting is to make it more difficult for the perpetrator to commit the act in the first place. Self-defense measures by civilians in mass shooting situations would not be impaired by the ban on assault rifles. The next argument I used to make is that if the majority of people carried guns on a regular basis, that crime would decrease because criminals would be afraid of being shot by law-abiding citizens. Although the crime statistics do not prove this out, even if it were true, this would not apply to assault rifles, as most people do not carry assault rifles around with them when they go out about their day-to-day activities. In the last 25 years of our country has run the experiment, and some states have loosened their gun laws, whereas others have tightened them. So I'd encourage you to look up the numbers for yourself, and you tell me whether looser gun laws result in less violent crime. I would only remind you to take into consideration the population size when you're doing your analysis and calculate the violent crime on a per capita basis and not as an aggregate number. I'd also like to point out that most mass shootings and school shootings occur within close geographic proximity of where the shooter resides. So local gun laws can and do make a difference. Do you think it's a coincidence that mass shootings involving high-powered assault rifles tend to occur in locations where those guns are more freely available. But even if a mass shooter were to buy his assault rifle and move across state lines to commit the crime, doesn't this just add weight to the argument that we should advocate for a national assault weapons ban? I want to emphasize I am completely sympathetic with those who feel the need to own firearms for self-defense. I myself am a diminutive person, and if I ever had to enter into physical combat, I would be unlikely to prevail against any man unless he was severely physically disabled or over the age of 95. So let me tell you about an instance that occurred to me when I was living in my first apartment. At the time, I was in my early 20s and did not have a lot of money, so I ended up renting this cheap apartment in a somewhat sketchy neighborhood. All went well until about halfway into my 9-month lease. A drug dealer moved into the apartment across the hall. Soon the hallways were filled with junkies who were oftentimes strung out. On more than one occasion, the junkies would mistake my door for my neighbor's door and knock as they were looking for him. It was more of an annoyance than a threat. I reported my neighbor's activities to the local authorities, but several weeks went by and seemingly nothing was done. Then, late one night, a man began pounding at my door, screaming my neighbor's name. He pounded so hard that I was afraid the door of my cheap apartment might actually come off the hinges. The apartment had no back door, so I had no practical route of escape. I was terrified, and I retrieved my revolver and was prepared to fire upon the man if the door gave way. Now, fortunately for both of us, my drug dealer neighbor appeared in the hallway and said something to the man, and the man stopped pounding. I don't know exactly what he said, but it resolved the situation. Now, some days later, the police eventually raided my neighbor's apartment, but he was able to jump out the back window as the police were coming in the front door, and he was able to give them the slip. So, given my experiences, I am completely sympathetic with the role that firearms play in the self-defense of law-abiding citizens. But this still does not change my view on the need for assault weapons. If things had gone differently, and the man had broken down my door, I would not have been better suited with an AR-15 rather than the .38 special revolver loaded with hollow points bullets that I had on hand. If I had to shoot the man with an AR-15, the bullet would have traveled through his body and would have likely penetrated the wall behind him, injuring or killing whomever was behind that wall. In contrast, the hollow point bullets of my .38 special revolver that I had loaded were designed to expand upon the impact and not exit out the other side. The next argument that I used to make is that guns are a part of American culture. Again, here, I would not necessarily disagree that guns have become an integral part of American culture, but we should ask ourselves that just because something is this way, does it mean that it needs to be? Cigarettes used to be a huge part of American culture. Try watching any movie made before 1960 and tell me that cigarettes weren't a huge part of American culture of that era. But just because it was culturally important, does that mean it was necessary and needed to stay that way? Ask yourself if the media depictions of cigarette smoking in early movies and television, the ubiquity of cigarettes, and the prevalence of locations that tolerated cigarette smoke did anything to encourage people of that era to take up the habit. Now ask yourself if the lengthening of life expectancy and the reduction of lung-related ailments has had anything to do with the diminished importance of cigarettes in culture today. Sure, we still have smokers, but as a percentage of the population, we have a lot less of them today than we did in 1950, when cigarette smoking was a prominent part of the cultural landscape. The same can be true for assault rifles. The fetishization of the assault rifle in American culture, particularly amongst American conservatives, is a problem. I agree that most people who purchase an AR-15 will never use it to commit acts of violence, but some will. and frequently the victims of assault rifle rampages will be children. I understand that recreational shooting can be a fun hobby, and as I stated before, I don't advocate for the complete elimination of private ownership of firearms. But if giving up one aspect of your hobby could reduce the number of victims in mass shootings, wouldn't it be worth it? The last argument I used to make is that there's a slippery slope from the ban on assault rifles to the ban on all guns. This argument is dragged out of the closet every time a politician advocates for some common sense gun control regulation. Again, I would point to the last 25 years of history to debunk this. There are many countries in the world that ban assault rifles, and yet do not ban all guns. Furthermore, countries with extremely restrictive gun control laws, such as England, Germany, and Australia, are not the Orwellian hellholes that the Second Amendment Absolutist would have you believe. If you had to pick between living in Russia with its loose gun laws, or Australia with its relatively restrictive gun laws, which would you choose? So, in conclusion, it's time for our society to move beyond the reactionary and spurious arguments of the Second Amendment Absolutist and look soberly at the mass shooting problem that we have in this country. When I was a young man, I was a Second Amendment Absolutist, but the last 25 years of American history has taught me that this position is untenable. We have witnessed the results of the expiration of the federal assault weapons ban in 2004, and it is bloody. The trend of mass shootings has only increased since 2004, which is contrary to the overall trend of a decrease in crime, which we have seen over that same period. The United States is a democracy, and we the people have the power to influence our lawmakers. I'm not saying that assault weapons ban is a panacea and will solve all of our violence problems that we have in this country, but it is a meaningful measure that we have the power to enact. I would ask that you reach out to your congressmen and senators and demand that the issue of assault weapon ban is revisited. I would also encourage you to seek out and support advocacy groups that work on this issue. Personally, I find the gun control position that are being advocated by the organization Sandy Hook Promise reasonable, and I have made a decision to financially support them. There are other advocacy organizations out there, and if you have found my video at all persuasive, I would encourage you to check them out. We do not have to tolerate mass shootings. There are real and concrete things that we can do to lower the body count. I want to thank you for your time.